답을 하는 식으로 진행되도록 하겠습니다. 큰 박수로 맞이해 주십시오.
Dear friends from Korea, as well as people from different countries which have come to this event, Armistice Day is a day of remembrance for the people of Korea. It's a historical landmark in the struggle for reunification. I'm very privileged to have this opportunity of participating in this 60th anniversary commemoration of Armistice Day. Our mandate and our agenda is ultimately to move forward towards a peace treaty and reunification. I am much indebted to the organizing committees of the anti-war peace People's Action Movement, as well as the Unified Progressive Party, for this opportunity and invitation. I think we first have to address the fact that in the course of the last 60 years, the United States has systematically violated the Armistice Agreement. It has created conditions of continuous and ongoing military threats. It has 37,000 troops on Korean soil. This is the only permanent US military force on the Asian continent, and it has also been actively involved in threatening Korea with nuclear war. And I say Korea because nuclear war would inevitably encompass the entire peninsula. I think it's important to understand that the conditions of that peace treaty require a parallel civilian bilateral debate between North and South. Because otherwise, there is the danger that the United States will impose or wish to impose its own conditions. And consequently, and those conditions have actually been already analyzed by Pentagon analysts. They are not based on the withdrawal of the 37,000 troops. The documents that I have consulted suggest exactly the opposite, that they are intent on increasing the number of US troops if and when there is a reunification of the two Koreas. We have to go back in history to 1945. There was no liberation following the defeat of the Japanese Empire and the entry of US forces. Quite the opposite. From one day to the next, a US military government was established, September 8, 1945, and in fact, Japanese officials collaborated with the US Army military government in setting the stage for a new colonial relationship. And this is very important because that colonial relationship is still, to a large extent, is still present. From the outset, it also refused, the US military government refused to recognize any civilian government, including the provisional government of the People's Republic of Korea, which was at the time committed to major social reforms, including land distribution, wages, employment policy, and so on. There was no democracy, no liberation, no independence, while Japan was treated as a defeated empire. South Korea was identified as a colonial territory to be administered under US military rule and US occupation forces. With regard, I will not dwell on the history of the Korean War itself, but I wish, I think, to emphasize that the Korean War was characterized by crimes against humanity, against the people of Korea, which are unprecedented in world history. The Korean War was also characterized by a practice of targeted assassinations, as we know, of political dissidents. And I think we have to understand that this practice set the stage for US interventions in other countries where targeted assassinations under the auspices of the CIA were applied, including Indonesia, Vietnam, Argentina, Argentina's dirty war, Guatemala, and many other countries, and more recently, of course, Afghanistan and Iraq. These extensive war crimes implied the mass killings of civilians in the course of the Korean War. In essence, the doctrine was an extension of the mass killings of civilians undertaken during World War II, North Korea was subjected to extensive carpet bombing, which resulted in the destruction virtually of every single city, village, and if you examine the statements of the US armed forces, the key generals, who were extremely cynical individuals, they acknowledged that, according to US Major General William M. Dean, that most of North Korean cities and villages were either rubble or snow-covered wastelands. There was an enormous destruction and loss of life during those 3 years. We can recall the historic statement of General Curtis LeMay, who coordinated the bombing raids, and who stated quite candidly, quote, "Over a period of 3 years or so, we killed off what? 20% of the population. We burned down every town in North Korea and South Korea as well." These are statements emanating from the US military. And the estimates of mortality in North Korea resulting from the Korean War of the order of 25% of the population. It's unprecedented in history. If we look at the history of the Second World War and the countries which were the victims of large-scale civilian casualties, and that included, of course, it included the Soviet Union, it included France, included China. But if we look at those countries, the United Kingdom lost less than 1% of its population, France about 1.3%, China 1.8%. The US lost less than about 0.3% of its population. But Korea, in the course of the Korean War, lost a quarter. North Korea lost a quarter of its population. And there have been various figures from different sources, but I think we have to acknowledge that this war was a criminal undertaking, and that war has not reached its completion because the armistice agreement is still there, and the 37,000 troops are still in place in South Korea. Now, if we look at what we read in newspapers, particularly in the West, but I presume also in the Republic of Korea, North Korea is heralded as a threat to global security. There's been a policy of deliberate political isolation of North Korea. The United States has sought to destabilize its economy, including its industrial base and agriculture. It has relentlessly strangled and undermined the process of economic growth, and it has also blocked the process of reunification between North and South. And I think the important question, particularly for Americans or for Westerners, is to ask the question, how can a country which has lost a quarter of its population resulting from US aggression constitute a threat to global security and the so-called American homeland? It's an absurd proposition. But most people in America don't know the history of this war. And moreover, they are fully unaware of the fact that the US nuclear threat does not emanate from North Korea. It emanates from the United States of America over a period of more than 60 years, since US nuclear weapons had been contemplated at the outset of the Korean War. They were not applied, they were not used, but certainly as of the early 50s, as of the mid-50s, we had a situation whereby the United States developed a nuclear weapons program. I'll discuss this a little bit later, and it has been a continuous process since the end of the Korean War. Washington's objective in Asia is to create political divisions, not only between North and South Korea, but also between North Korea and China. The ultimate objective is also to threaten China. In other words, the so-called Asian pivot is a much broader process of militarization, which threatens Russia and China with nuclear warheads, and it's geared towards the militarization of both East Asia and Southeast Asia under what is referred to as the Asian pivot. And clearly the North-South relationship between the two Koreas is something which is fundamental to to the formulation of this Asian pivot. China is virtually encircled. It is encircled not only with regard to the East China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, the Sea of Japan, and the South China Sea, but also on China's western borders. It's a policy of encirclement which has been ongoing for quite a number of years. And the militarization of the Korean Peninsula is part of that process. Why? Because the joint US Republic of Korea military facilities are essentially directed against China. And Jeju Island is an obvious example. It's directly opposite Shanghai. And I should also mention, and that's very important, that under the United States Combined Forces Command, the Republic of Korea forces are de facto under US command. They're not under national command. Because under the Combined Forces Command, it is a US general which ultimately stands right at the top, so that the Republic of Korea does not control its own armed forces. The commander-in-chief of the Korean armed forces is, of course, the President of the Republic of Korea, but in fact, she is overridden by the US general who is appointed by the Pentagon. And that is, of course, very important. I know that the CFC agreement is now being discussed, that it will be disbanded, but in fact it should be disbanded immediately. And it is a precondition to any kind of peace negotiations. So that at least Republic of Korea forces will be under national command and will not be subjected to any kind of US foreign policy directives with regard to military operations in and around the Korean Peninsula and in East Asia. What this means in effect is that in addition to the 37,000 US troops which are in Korea, in South Korea under a bogus United Nations mandate, which has in fact been repealed by the United Nations, the US command structure has de facto control over all operational units of the Korean armed forces. And in essence, that means that the Republic of Korea does not control its armed forces. And that's a very important consideration. Now let me turn my attention to the nuclear issue. And again, I'd like to go back in history and examine the background of US nuclear doctrine. US nuclear doctrine did not take its roots in the Cold War. It took its roots in Hiroshima in 1945. And what's important to understand is that the strategic objective of Hiroshima was to trigger a massive casualty-producing event, resulting in tens and thousands of deaths. The objective was to terrorize an entire nation as a means of military conquest. Military targets were not the main objective. The notion of collateral damage was used to justify the mass killing of civilians under the pretense that Hiroshima was a military base. Now, nobody in the upper echelons of the US government and the military believed that Hiroshima was a military base. And Truman was in fact lying to himself and to the American public. But what I should emphasize is that this Hiroshima doctrine of creating massive casualties, of killing civilians, is something which prevailed in the course of the Korean War through conventional warfare, but it is also part of a military doctrine which in essence is somewhat remote from the Cold War concept of mutually assured destruction and the concepts of the mutually assured destruction and deterrence which characterized the nuclear doctrine during the Cold War era. But when nuclear weapons were envisaged to be used against Korea, it was rather the Hiroshima doctrine which prevailed. That of terrorizing a nation, that of eventually using nuclear weapons to create mass casualties. This was not implemented, but at the same time, it's the whole history of military buildup of the nuclear war machine, which started in effect in 1958. But in fact, the barely 3 years or 2.5 years after the end of the Korean War, the United States had already planned for the deployment of nuclear warheads in South Korea, in Ujongbu and Anyangni, and that was envisaged as early as 1956. So then count the years during which Korea has been threatened by nuclear weapons, starting with the earlier stockpile of nuclear weapons in South Korea, which stockpiling and deployment in South Korea, which extended from 1958 to 1991, a period of 31 years, okay? For a period of 33 years. A period of 33 years, there were nuclear weapons stationed on Korean soil which were directed against Korea. It sounds absurd, okay? That you would actually have weapons within your own country and direct them against your own country. And I say that because of the geography of this country. We are approximately 1 hour from the demilitarized zone. So anybody who has a minimal understanding of nuclear warheads knows that an attack on North Korea is an attack on the whole country, on the whole peninsula. Now, I should also mention that South Korea also had a nuclear program, which theoretically and officially was supposed to be separate from that of the United States. It started in the early 1970s. The official story was that the United States tried to dissuade the Republic of Korea from developing nuclear warheads. But if you view the fact that there was a joint command between the US forces and the ROK forces, it is absolutely clear that this South Korean nuclear weapons program was sponsored by the United States and was integrated into that of the United States. These were not separate programs. And then the United States encouraged the Republic of Korea to sign the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in 1975, and in fact this was what we call in English a red herring. It was there to distract people's attention from the fact that the United States were developing a weapons program with the support of the Republic of Korea, using local knowledge and science and technology to implement and integrate that program into its own nuclear weapons arsenal. Now, the removal of nuclear warheads from the Korean Peninsula was officially in 1991, and this removal did not in any way signify a withdrawal or a shift in America's nuclear weapons policy with regard to North Korea. It was simply a shift in the process of delivery of these nuclear weapons. And the technology of intercontinental missiles had evolved, and what was announced is that the weapons were removed from South Korea, and the last weapons were removed in 1991, and then most of the weapons which are now targeted at Korea are either based in continental United States or in military facilities of the United States around the world, including, of course, strategic submarines and so on. So it's a shift, it's not a shift, it's not a disarmament, it in fact is a rearmament, because these technologies are far more sophisticated than those which were initially stationed in South Korea starting in 1958. I should mention, if we want to put some figures on this, because the important question is, who is the threat? Okay? Now, if you read the newspapers in the United States or anywhere in the Western world, North Korea is the threat. And it's not only a threat locally, but it is a threat to the security of the United States. Now, if we put this in the broader perspective, there's what I call an asymmetry in nuclear weapons capabilities between the United States and North Korea. They are, according to the most recent data, more than 5,000 US warheads stockpiled and deployed. Not all of them are deployed. Out of those 5,000, there are more than 1,600 strategic nuclear warheads which are deployed, and there are another 500 so-called tactical nuclear weapons. I should explain that a tactical nuclear weapon is called a mini-nuke, but they're not so small as what they appear to be. They have an explosive capacity between 1/3 and 6 times a Hiroshima bomb. There's another 500 of those. So what we have is 2,000, over 2,000 nuclear bombs are currently targeted, and they are targeted against North Korea. They're also targeted against a number of other countries. Because in other words, it's the principle of multiple targeting. So you have 2,000 nuclear weapons which are targeted and which are deployed, okay, out of approximately 5,600 if I count the tactical nuclear weapons. So we're talking about an arsenal, a formidable arsenal. And the question we have to ask ourselves, who is the military threat? Who is the threat? Where does the threat come from? From North Korea or from the United States of America? That is the important question to be raised. If I look at the same sources, the same data bank and sources which provide the information on the US nuclear weapons program, the statement is as follows. The DPRK, according to the same source, has separated enough plutonium for roughly 4 to 8 nuclear warheads, but there's no evidence that North Korea has a means to actually deliver these nuclear weapons, and it has not, according to expert opinion, North Korea does not yet have much of a nuclear arsenal because it lacks fissile material and has limited nuclear testing experience, and its capabilities to deliver these weapons are virtually nil, okay, in a meaningful way. And of course, if you read the newspapers, we get exactly the opposite, that North Korea's attack on America is imminent, but yet none of these newspapers have the honesty to review the history and acknowledge that the US nuclear weapons program directed against Korea started 63 years ago in 1950, and in a more active way in 1956, but we're talking about more than half a century of nuclear warheads and threats and war games which are well understood, and consequently this latest saga of accusations directed at North Korea is a clear case of media disinformation and double standards. The real threat to global security comes from the United States and its allies, from the nuclear powers. And consequently, the peace negotiations have to address the issue not of North Korean nuclear weapons, but of the threat of nuclear warfare emanating from the United States of America. So that means not only the withdrawal of the 37,000 troops, the repeal of the Joint Command structure, which provides the basis for the United States to take control over the ROK military and all its personnel and operational units, but it is also important to address the issue of nuclear disarmament of the main military actor in the world today and the main aggressor nation, which is the United States of America. And these threats are being implemented in various regions of the world. It's a project of global warfare which is formulated at the upper echelons of the US government and military. The United States, in essence, is still at war with Korea. This state of war, I should mention, is directed against both North and South Korea. It's characterized by persistent military threats, and the threats to the Republic of Korea are in the form of military occupation. And this military occupation is also being used to strangle the process of government policy, ultimately. I say from my own experience as an economist, if it hadn't been for the 37,000 troops in the Republic of Korea, there wouldn't have been an Asian crisis in the way it occurred in 1997-98. Why? Because those policies were imposed by Washington. The change of the finance minister, the central bank governor, the imposition of IMF reforms, the sale-off of Daewoo, the streamlining of Korea First Bank, I don't want to dwell on these issues, but in fact, in previous visits to Korea, I've examined these in great detail. But I say to you, military withdrawal should also lead the way to economic withdrawal. In other words, the fact that the Korean economy is overshadowed by corporate and banking interests, indeed, the business elites in Korea are complicit, but they are also the victims. I'm not saying I'm sorry for them, but they are the victims, because some of these business empires were broken up on the orders of Washington. Okay? So, military withdrawal, economic withdrawal are preconditions for a peace treaty. But they have to be negotiated between North and South prior to the formal peace treaty negotiations between the parties of the armistice. I should say that prior to the forthcoming negotiations pertaining to a peace treaty, it should be understood that the United States and the Republic of Korea are not allies. Why are they not allies? Because the Republic of Korea is under military occupation. So allies, in a sense, there's a certain reciprocity, but there's no reciprocity. And the only true alliances that have to be built are the alliances within Korea and between, of course, North and South. And that's something for the Korean people to decide upon. But it is absolutely essential that these issues be debated and discussed and negotiated in parallel and prior to a peace agreement. And I will conclude by just giving you a couple of quotes from a US military document to the fact that the issue of the peace agreement and reunification has already been analyzed very carefully by Pentagon specialists, and they have already stated that in the case of a peace treaty and a reunification, that the United States will increase and not decrease its military involvement in the Korean Peninsula. Let me give you the quotation. It says, in any realistic post-unification scenario, US forces are likely to have some role in stability operations in North Korea. So they already want to go and station troops in North Korea. And then they say, for the present, any reduction in capabilities of the current US garrison on the peninsula would be unwise. If anything, there is a need to increase them in the case of reunification. So those are elements which have to be addressed if we don't want the aggressor nation to dictate the terms of the peace treaty. The peace treaty requires a commitment on the withdrawal of all US troops from the Korean Peninsula, and also a process of nuclear disarmament of all weapon systems directed against the Korean Peninsula. Otherwise, that peace treaty will constitute not a peace treaty, but an extension of the ongoing military occupation of South Korea. My thoughts are with the people of Korea in this endeavor, and we look forward to returning to to a united Korea in the years ahead. Thank you very much.